It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I'd just come off a tough run of shifts, 12 hours each, and finally had a couple of days to myself. No alarms, no paperwork, no radio buzzing in my ear. Just peace, coffee, and catching up on sleep. That was the plan. Anyway, I live in a gated community, out past the edge of town. It's a nice place, trees, hills, and long driveways. The kind of neighborhood where people nod at each other, but mostly keep to themselves. I liked it that way. I wasn't there to socialize or gossip. I kept my lawn clean, paid my dues, minded my own business. But the HOA, that was a different story. When I moved in, I'd heard the usual chatter, how strict the board could be, how their rules kept the place clean and orderly. I figured as long as I wasn't letting trash pile up or hosting wild parties, I'd be fine. I'd dealt with worse. I'm in law enforcement, after all. Real law enforcement. I don't rattle easy. At first, it was little things. Notices for minor issues, like my trash bin being visible from the street for a few hours too long. Then a warning about my porch light, not matching the neighborhood aesthetic. I ignored the pettiness and moved on. Not worth the energy. Then came the security patrols. Now, real neighborhoods hire actual security, licensed, trained, professional. Not here. Our HOA had hired some local private company, but these guys weren't your average guards. They wore mock uniforms, complete with badges that said HOA enforcement, and drove around in white SUVs with fake light bars on top. They weren't cops, but they sure acted like it. One of them started showing up near my property a little too often. I'd spot him idling by the edge of my fence, pretending to check something on a clipboard. A few times, he'd roll by slowly, watching my house like I was under surveillance. I let it go for a while, assuming maybe they were just overzealous. Then one morning, I found a yellow notice of violation taped to my front door. It claimed I had an unauthorized vehicle parked in my driveway. The vehicle? My off-duty patrol truck, unmarked but fully legal. I called the HOA office and explained, calmly. The woman on the phone sounded nervous, like she didn't even believe the notice was real. She promised to look into it. A few days later, a different officer from the HOA security company came by. He knocked once, then started taking pictures of my property from the sidewalk. I stepped outside and asked him what he was doing. He said they were conducting compliance checks. I asked him if he had a warrant or a written authorization from a board. He mumbled something and left. That's when I realized they weren't just annoying. They were escalating. I decided to keep a closer watch. Installed a few discreet cameras around my property. Not that I needed them, but I wanted everything documented. I let my sheriff's department know what was going on, just to cover my bases. Then came the morning it all changed. It was just past 6 a.m. I was asleep in a recliner downstairs, badge and duty belt resting on the side table. I hadn't even bothered to make it to the bedroom. I'd been up late reading reports and just dozed off with the news still playing low on the TV. My front door was unlocked. I know some people would say that's careless, but out here, it wasn't uncommon. And I'm not the kind of guy who scares easy. Suddenly, I heard the door creak open. At first, I thought maybe it was a wind, but the hinges moved slow, deliberate. I stayed still, listened. I heard a voice, low, muttering something like, "Check over here." Then footsteps. 2 of them. I opened my eyes but didn't move. 2 men stepped into my living room. Both wore dark polo shirts with HOA security stitched across the chest. One held a small flashlight, sweeping it across the room. The other had a clipboard and what looked like zip ties on his belt. They didn't see me right away. I sat there in the shadows, watching. They weren't searching. They were snooping. My front door wide open behind them. And then the one with the flashlight turned and saw me sitting there, calm as could be, staring him straight in the eye. He froze. His buddy looked over, and his mouth opened just slightly. They hadn't just walked into a house. They had walked into the wrong one. The one with the flashlight took a step back, so fast he nearly tripped over the rug. His eyes darted from me to the badge on the table, then to my belt lying next to it. He didn't say a word. The other guy, still clutching his clipboard like a shield, was frozen halfway to the kitchen. I could tell they weren't expecting anyone to be home, especially not someone who was clearly law enforcement. I didn't stand up. I didn't need to. I just looked at them, letting the silence hang in the air. You could feel the panic building. These guys weren't trained. They weren't ready for real confrontation. They were used to taping warnings to doors and yelling at teenagers for loud music. Now they were inside a deputy sheriff's living room without a warrant, a call, or any legal right to be there. After a few seconds, I asked, calm and low, "You two mind telling me what you're doing in my house?" They looked at each other like two kids caught sneaking cookies out of a jar. The flashlight guy finally stammered, "We got a report. Someone said there might be, suspicious activity inside. So, wellness check." A wellness check? I repeated slowly, making sure they could hear the disbelief in my voice. By private security? Clipboard guy tried to jump in. "Sir, the HOA authorizes us to respond to." "You're not police." I cut him off, still not raising my voice. "You're not EMS. And you definitely don't have the authority to enter someone's home without permission." They didn't argue. They couldn't. They knew they were in deep. I stood up slowly, deliberately. Both of them flinched. I didn't reach for my belt or my badge. I didn't have to. The tone in my voice was enough. "You boys just broke into a deputy sheriff's house," I said, stepping toward them. "And I've got you on camera. Multiple angles." Their faces drained of color. They both started talking over each other, backpedaling fast. "We didn't know. Nobody said it was your house. We were just following procedure." "Your procedure," I said, "doesn't override state law. You entered a private home without consent. That's a crime." I reached for my phone and called it in. Not 911. I didn't want a full-blown panic. I called dispatch directly. Told them to send a patrol unit over. Told them I had two unauthorized intruders from an HOA security company inside my home. Told them I was safe but needed statements taken and evidence collected. That's when the panic turned to desperation. Flashlight guy asked if they could just leave. Said it was all a big misunderstanding. Clipboard guy tried to hand me some paper, probably some kind of fake inspection form. I didn't touch it. "No one's leaving until the real cops show up," I said. "If you got nothing to hide, you'll sit tight and answer questions." To my surprise, they actually did. Or maybe they realized trying to run would just make things worse. They sat down on the edge of my couch, hands in their laps like two kids waiting for the principal. I kept an eye on them while I checked my front camera feed. Sure enough, clear footage of them walking right in. No knock, no hesitation, just arrogance. 20 minutes later, a cruiser rolled up. Two officers got out, both younger guys I'd trained with a few years back. They recognized me immediately and got serious fast. I gave them the footage, showed them the fake citations, and let them hear the shaky explanation from the HOA guys. The officers took notes, asked questions, and then escorted the two cops outside to wait in the back of the cruiser. I could see one of them trying to explain to the neighbors, who were starting to gather outside. Word spreads fast in communities like ours, especially when two fake officers are being questioned in front of someone's home. I stood at the door, arms crossed, watching all unfold. It was surreal. These guys had strutted around our streets for months, barking orders and threatening fines. And now, they couldn't even explain why they thought they could enter someone's house without permission. But what struck me most was this. They really believed they had power. Not real power, but the illusion of it. And they were finally learning what happens when that illusion gets shattered. After the cruiser pulled away with the two HOA cops in the back, I sat on my porch and watched as neighbors peeked through their blinds or stepped cautiously into their driveways. A few crossed the street pretending to check their mail, trying to act casual, but you could feel the curiosity buzzing like electricity in the air. This wasn't something they expected to see. And it definitely wasn't something the HOA expected anyone to challenge. One of my neighbors, Mr. Keller, a retired mechanic who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, slowly walked up and leaned on my fence. "Heard something went down," he said, pretending he hadn't seen the whole thing from his garage window. I nodded. Let's just say a couple of security guards forgot what the word private means. He gave a low whistle. I knew they were pushing it. But breaking into your house? That's another level. He wasn't wrong. For months, the HOA had been gradually turning up the heat. Small rules became big ones. Notices turned into threats. They handed out fines for things that weren't even in the handbook. Petty nonsense like mailbox color, grass height, or the type of mulch someone used. The so-called security team would follow people home, question guests, and act like they were running a military base. The scary part was most folks just let it happen. Some were too old to fight it. Others were too busy. And a few actually believed the HOA had real authority. That's how they operated, on fear, confusion, and silence. But now that silence was cracking. By the next morning, word had spread to every corner of the neighborhood. The HOA board sent out a group email calling the incident a misunderstanding and claiming the officers had been responding to a concerned reported distress. No apology, no responsibility, just a neat little excuse typed out in corporate language. But the people weren't buying it. Neighbors started coming by, some knocking for the first time since I moved in. They shared their own stories. Patrols taking pictures of their kids playing in the yard, late-night notices slipped under doors, citations for things they never did. One woman said she caught a security guard standing behind her fence with a flashlight. Another guy, a quiet type who worked construction, said they tried to tell him his pickup truck violated visual standards. They weren't just mad, they were ready. By the weekend, a small crowd gathered at the community center. Word had gotten out that the sheriff's department had filed a formal report on the HOA's private security team. A few deputies even showed up, not to intimidate, but to clarify what real authority looked like. I was there too, mostly listening, answering questions when asked. One man stood up and said what everyone had been thinking. We don't live in a prison. We pay to live here. But we're being treated like we're all criminals. That was the moment it shifted. You could feel it in the room. The board tried to hold their usual meeting, sticking to the agenda, pretending nothing serious had happened. But the community pushed back. They demanded answers. They asked about contracts, who hired the security firm, who approved their policies, why there were no safeguards in place. The board members looked uncomfortable, fumbled through paperwork, avoided eye contact. Then someone brought up a vote, one to suspend the HOA security contract entirely until a third-party review could be done. That got loud support. Hands raised, voices firm. Suddenly, the board wasn't in control anymore. When I got home that night, I checked my cameras again. Not a single patrol car had driven by all day. The same street where I'd once seen a security guard slowly crawling past my mailbox twice in one afternoon was finally quiet. I sat on my porch, just like before, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. For the first time in a long while, it actually felt peaceful again, not because someone had been arrested, but because people finally saw through the act. The illusion of control, once broken, doesn't rebuild itself easily, and now that the neighborhood had seen it for what it was, they weren't going back to silence. Not again. The silence didn't last long. Just when the neighborhood began to settle down, just when we thought we'd regain control, the HOA decided to dig in their heels. They weren't ready to give up their grip. Not by a long shot. It started subtly. A few neighbors who had spoken up at the meeting got fresh violation letters. Suddenly, their landscaping was out of code, or their trash bins were left out too long. One family was fined for having an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway, a guest car, parked there for less than an hour. It was retaliation, clear as day. The board wasn't to let go without reminding everyone who they thought was in charge. Then came the real surprise. The HOA doubled down on the security company. Instead of suspending the contract like the community had overwhelmingly supported, the board sent out an email announcing they'd renewed the agreement, with updated training and new oversight procedures. It was spin, nothing more. They'd made a show of change, but behind the curtain, the same people were still pulling the strings. And as if to prove a point, the patrols started up again. But this time, they weren't just rolling by slowly. Now they were bold, parking on people's lawns to investigate noise complaints. shining lights into windows late at night, standing near playgrounds and taking photos for documentation. They were daring the neighborhood to react, like they wanted someone to snap. I kept my distance, but I kept my eyes open. One night, I spotted the same guard from the break-in incident parked across from my house. He didn't get out. Just sat there, engine running, lights off, watching. Maybe he thought he was intimidating me. Maybe he didn't realize I'd already filed a personal complaint against the company through the sheriff's office. The next day, I walked across the street and stood right in front of his SUV. Didn't say a word. Just stared through the windshield until he slowly backed out and drove away. I wanted him to know I hadn't forgotten, and I wasn't scared. Behind the scenes, I was doing more than just watching. I started collecting stories. Neighbors began sending me screenshots of notices, pictures of guards, video clips from doorbell cams. I kept a folder. Every incident was time-stamped, geotag labeled. I wasn't building a case for drama. I was building one for truth. Then something strange happened. A resident named Julia, quiet, retired, always kept to herself, showed up at my door with a folder in her hands. She told me her late husband had served on the HOA board years ago, back before the current president took over. She still had copies of the original bylaws, board meeting notes, and most importantly, paperwork on how the HOA was supposed to operate. What she handed me changed everything. Buried in those papers were restrictions about private security, strict ones. The HOA wasn't even allowed to hire outside enforcement without a community-wide vote. That vote had never happened. Everything the board had been doing, from patrols to citations backed by fake authority, it was all unauthorized, illegitimate, possibly even criminal. We had what we needed now. That weekend, I hosted a small gathering at my house. Not a protest, not a rally, just a conversation. We laid the documents out on the table, step by step. I explained what I'd found, what Julia had brought, and what the law actually said. No shouting, no speeches, just facts. And facts, it turned out, were more powerful than any patrol car. A plan began to form, one stronger than the HOA had counted on. This wasn't about getting revenge or making noise. It was about accountability. We didn't need to break rules. We just needed to enforce the ones they'd ignored. And as more neighbors joined in, sharing documents, comparing notes, drafting statements, we began to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about two guys breaking into my house. It was about years of unchecked control, years of fear disguised as order. But those days were numbered, because now, for the first time, the entire neighborhood knew the truth. And the HOA, they had no idea just how many of us were standing together. The board tried to act like nothing had changed. They carried on with their monthly newsletter, full of passive-aggressive reminders about lawn edges and approved paint palettes. But there was something different now, a tension, a nervousness, even in their words. The usual confidence in their tone had slipped, replaced by carefully worded phrases like pending review and under advisement. They knew the walls were closing in. Neighbors were no longer whispering behind closed doors. They were talking out in the open, comparing letters, calling out inconsistencies, questioning everything. The HOA's once firm grip on the community had cracked, and behind that crack was a flood of truth waiting to pour through. I'd spent the past week organizing the folder. Hundreds of screenshots, testimonies, and video clips. The evidence wasn't just about harassment or overreach. It showed a pattern of abuse, targeted citations, intimidation tactics, even financial irregularities with how fines were collected and how the private security firm got paid. It wasn't just shady. It might have been illegal, but we needed more than anger. We needed action. So I reached out to a local attorney who specialized in HOA law. He agreed to meet us pro bono after hearing what had happened. When he walked into my living room, the table was covered in paperwork, photos, and laptops. He took one look at it all and nodded slowly. "You got something real here," he said. "And if you're right about the missing vote on the security contract, that's a major violation." He explained what we'd need to do, how to gather official support from homeowners, how to file a motion to audit the HOA board, and most importantly, how to demand a community-wide vote to dissolve the security contract entirely. It would take organization and persistence, but we weren't alone anymore. That made all the difference. Within days, we had a petition circulating, not through whisper networks, but door to door, on street corners, at park benches. People were eager to sign, not just because of what had happened to me, but because they were tired of feeling powerless in their own homes. Tired of the fake authority driving slowly past their porches with clipboards and cold stares. Tired of the HOA pretending they were above the very rules they enforced. And then came the day we'd all been waiting for, the emergency town hall meeting. The board looked nervous. The room was packed. Neighbors who never attended before were now seated in the aisles, some even standing at the back. The attorney sat beside me, along with Julia and several other residents who had helped dig up the original bylaws. On the table in front of us sat the petition, now with over 70% of homeowner signatures. Well over what we needed. The board tried to open with their usual formalities, but the crowd wasn't having it. People demanded answers. We asked them directly, when had the vote taken place, who signed off on the private security deal. Why weren't residents informed? They danced around the questions, but the attorney pressed harder. He read directly from the bylaws. He showed the missing pages. He explained that the contract was null and void without full transparency and vote approval. There was no way for them to spin it. Not anymore. Finally, after nearly an hour of pressure, the board president mumbled something about stepping back to review policies. It wasn't an admission, but it was close. And it told us one thing. They were on the defensive now. After the meeting, no one rushed home. People gathered outside in clusters, shaking hands, clapping each other on the backs, exchanging phone numbers. There was no fear left in the air, just unity. For the first time, we all felt like we belonged to a real community. One that stood up, looked power in the face, and said, "Enough." The patrol cars didn't show up that night. In fact, they didn't show up for days. And inside the HOA office, tucked away in a locked filing cabinet, were years of secrets finally being dragged into the daylight by the very people they were meant to control. A week passed, and everything started feeling different, almost unfamiliar. The usual slow crawl of the fake patrol cars had vanished. No more tinted window SUVs idling at corners or snapping pictures through half-cracked windows. The sound of tires crunching slowly over gravel outside my house had become a habit I didn't even know I'd learned to brace for. And now that silence, it felt louder than ever. Neighbors noticed too. You could see it in the way people stood a little straighter when walking their dogs, or how families spent longer in their yards. One kid even set up a lemonade stand near the intersection where the HOA's patrol car used to park every weekend. He waved at every car that passed, like he was reclaiming the space. It was small, but it meant something. But the board wasn't done playing games. Not yet. Just when it seemed like we were regaining our footing, they sent out another official letter, this time stamped Urgent HOA Notice. They claimed a sudden uptick in neighborhood safety risks and cited vague incidents involving trespassers, vandalism, and possible gang activity. No police reports, no evidence, just words meant to scare people. It was their last attempt to justify reinstating the security contract. The difference now? Nobody was buying it. Residents who once stayed quiet were writing back. They were asking questions publicly, CCing neighbors on every email, quoting bylaws in bold print. It was clear. People had tasted the truth, and they weren't about to swallow fear again. And that's when the HOA made their final mistake. A letter arrived at my house. Not just mine. Dozens of us got the same one. It claimed we were deliberately disrupting community cohesion and threatened legal action for spreading false information about board members and HOA operations. That one letter flipped the switch. What was once frustration turned into something stronger, resolve. The attorney stepped in again, this time with formal cease and desist response directed back at the HOA. He also filed a request of the county clerk's office to review the HOA's financial records under transparency laws. If they wanted to play legal hardball, we were ready. But something even bigger was building now, momentum. We formed a neighborhood committee. Not a fake title like Community Aesthetics Council that the HOA loved so much. This was real. Volunteers from every corner of the neighborhood. Teachers, veterans, stay-at-home parents, young couples, seniors. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a reason to want change. We met weekly. We created a shared drive for documents. We printed and distributed educational flyers that broke down HOA powers, laws, and residents' rights in plain English. We even launched a simple website so anyone could see exactly what had happened, step by step. No conspiracy, no emotion, just facts. Then came the story that changed everything. A woman named Cassandra, who lived at the end of the street, came forward with a copy of her recorded phone call with one of the HOA board members. He didn't know she was recording. On the call, he admitted the board had never read the full security contract. He laughed about the cops being just rent-a-badges and even joked, as long as they look official, people listen. That call spread like wildfire. People listened, and this time they reacted. Cassandra shared the recording during the next town meeting. No yelling, no drama. She just played it on a speaker and let it speak for itself. That audio did more than documents or petitions ever could. It exposed the truth in a way no one could deny. Afterward, even the most loyal supporters of the board were quiet. Some turned away. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The power the HOA had clung to for years was dissolving in real time, and all it took was one woman, one phone call, and a room full of people ready to listen. The next few days were filled with phone calls and emails, resignations from board members, apologies from neighbors who once defended the rules blindly, and finally, a notice announcing a special vote to restructure the entire HOA leadership. No more shadows. No more silence. Just a neighborhood finally remembering it had a voice. By the time the special vote rolled around, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed completely. You could feel it walking down the sidewalk. Windows open. People talking over fences again, kids riding their bikes without worried glances toward passing cars. What once felt like a place monitored and micromanaged now started feeling like home again. But the day of the vote, that was something else entirely. People showed up in droves. Some came with folded lawn chairs tucked under their arms. Others carried coolers and drinks like it was a block party. For once, the energy wasn't rooted in fear or frustration. It was fueled by purpose. Not everyone agreed on everything, but everyone agreed that what had been happening wasn't right. The difference now was that no one was afraid to say it. I stood near the entrance of the clubhouse where voting was set to take place. A long line wrapped down the steps and into the parking lot. Some of the same folks who had barely nodded at each other in the past were now greeting each other like old friends. It wasn't just about voting. It was about showing up, about being seen. The ballots were straightforward. Remove the current board, elect temporary leadership, and dissolve the private security contract until a full community review could take place. For a group that once twisted rules to their benefit, it was ironic how quickly things fell apart when the rules were actually followed. By mid-afternoon, people began comparing notes on who they'd seen walk in to vote. Names that had once only appeared at the bottom of aggressive HOA letters were now just faces in the crowd. The president of the board? He sat in his car at the edge of the lot, never even walked inside. One by one, the empire he built on control and intimidation was unraveling, and he didn't even have the courage to face the people anymore. As ballots were counted, I didn't go inside. I stayed out front, helping pass out cold water, and answering questions from a few folks who still felt unsure. Some were worried about retaliation. Others didn't want to be seen as troublemakers. But this wasn't rebellion. This was responsibility. That's what we reminded them. This neighborhood didn't belong to any board or badge. It belonged to the people living in it. Around 6 p.m., the results were announced. The room erupted in cheers that echoed down the block. Every single measure passed. The board was gone. The contract was canceled. A temporary leadership committee, made up of actual homeowners, would take over until a full election could be held. The old order had finally fallen, and it hadn't taken threats or force. It had taken truth, persistence, and community. But even with the victory, things didn't go back to normal overnight. That's not how real change works. The mess left behind by years of unchecked power couldn't be cleaned up in a single day. There were records to audit, bylaws to update, people protect who had spoken up. But this time, we weren't waiting for someone else to fix it. We were doing it ourselves. The first committee meeting was held the following week. Instead of being locked behind closed doors, it was live streamed for every resident to watch. Questions were submitted openly. Votes were transparent. Suggestions were written down and followed up on. No more backroom decisions. No more fear. I sat in the front row with a notebook on my lap, not because I was in charge, but because I wanted to help however I could. So, did everyone else. Even folks who once kept their heads down were now volunteering to mow public lawns or repaint signs or update the community bulletin. People had gone from scared to proud, from silence to empowered. And while the scars of what we'd gone through are still fresh, they serve as reminders of what happens when power goes unchecked and neighbors stop trusting one another. We hadn't just changed leadership. We'd changed the entire culture. Late that evening, I stood on my porch, the same place where everything had started when 2 fake cops kicked in my door. The stars above the ranch were clearer than they'd ever looked. Not because the night was different, but because we were, for the first time in a long while, the silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. It was earned. And no uniform, no board, no threat could ever take that back from us again.